All right, so anyone who's even glanced at a history book has heard the name Napoleon, right?
Right.
But there's a reason he's more than just a name. I mean, we're talking about a guy whose ambition and impact we're still trying to wrap our heads around even today.
Oh, absolutely. His story, it goes way beyond just battles and dates. When you really look at Napoleon, you're looking at a period of massive upheaval. You know, that shift from the 18th to the 19th centuries.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And to help us get a handle on this larger-than-life figure, we're turning to a biography that really gets to the heart of it. It's called The Man Who Redefined Europe. Just the title alone kind of gives you chills. But here's something that really jumped out at me right from the start. Napoleon was born in 1769.
Okay.
Just 1 year
Wow.
after Corsica became French territory. Talk about being born at a crossroads in history.
It's like he was meant to embody that tension, you know, that Corsican identity, but under French rule. I think that duality really shaped his perspective. Maybe it even explains some of that relentless drive.
It's like he had something to prove right from day one. So let's talk about those early years in Corsica. The book really dives into his education, math, military strategy, even leadership. I mean, it almost seems like a straight shot to emperor looking back.
Well, you know, it's never that simple. His education definitely laid the groundwork for all those successes later on. But you got to remember, Corsica, even under French rule, it had its own distinct culture, a history of fierce independence. I think those Corsican roots, they instilled a kind of ambition in Napoleon that went beyond anything he could have learned in a book.
It's not just what he learned, but where he learned it. Like the context adds a whole other layer to his ambition.
Exactly. The seeds of that drive, they were planted right there in the rugged landscape of Corsica.
Okay, so we've got this young, ambitious, strategically minded Napoleon coming of age, and then boom, the French Revolution explodes onto the scene in 1789. I mean, the timing is almost too perfect, right?
Yeah.
What an opportunity for someone with his talents. The book really highlights those early victories in Italy. Was that the turning point? Did those victories make him an instant hero?
The timing was incredible. France was in total chaos. They were desperate for stability and someone who could restore their glory. And then Napoleon, with his tactical brilliance, he walks onto the scene at the perfect moment.
But it wasn't just about winning battles, was it? I mean, there are a lot of skilled military leaders in history. What was it about Napoleon that captured the imagination of the French people?
He had charisma. There's no doubt about it. That magnetic personality that resonated with the whole revolutionary spirit. They saw in him a leader who could win battles, but also someone who embodied those ideals. You know, liberty, equality, fraternity.
So he was able to tap into that revolutionary energy and use it.
Absolutely. That's what makes this period so fascinating. Napoleon, the master strategist, he understood that real power wasn't just about military might. It was about capturing the hearts and minds of the people.
Speaking of power, let's talk about the big shift from brilliant general to emperor. I mean, wasn't France supposed to be done with monarchs?
Well, revolutions, even with all their lofty ideals, they often create these power vacuums. And Napoleon was brilliant on the battlefield, but he was just as skilled at navigating the world of politics. The coup of 18 Brumaire in 1799, when he essentially maneuvered himself into that position of first consul, it really showed his political savvy.
So he saw an opening and he took it.
Yeah.
This wasn't just some accident.
No, not at all. Okay. This was calculated. He saw the weakness of the French government, and he used his popularity and his military influence to position himself as the answer to the chaos.
And then just a few years later, boom, Emperor Napoleon in 1804. That's a pretty big jump from a republic, don't you think?
Oh, it was a complete shift. It marked the end of that revolutionary fervor and the beginning of a new era for France, an era where they aimed to reshape not only their own destiny, but the destiny of Europe with Napoleon at the helm. And it really reveals his ambition. You know, he wasn't satisfied with leading armies. He wanted to build an empire.
A builder, not just a destroyer.
Yeah.
That's not the side of Napoleon you always hear about.
That's right. And one of the best examples of that is the Napoleonic Code. The book goes into some detail about this. It wasn't just about conquering land. Napoleon wanted to create lasting institutions.
Okay, now this is where things get interesting for me. Because we all know about the Napoleonic Wars, but what was so groundbreaking about this code?
The Napoleonic Code was a monumental achievement. It took that mess of regional laws that existed in France before the Revolution and replaced it with a unified legal system, a system based on principles like equality before the law, secularism, protection of property rights.
Those sound like pretty radical ideas for that time.
Absolutely. And they weren't just ideas. They were codified into law, affecting the lives of millions. And the impact went way beyond France. The Napoleonic Code became a model for legal systems all across Europe. even influencing systems in Latin America.
So Napoleon, the reformer, the
Yeah.
legal scholar, that's not the image that usually comes to mind.
Right, but it's a vital part of his story. It shows that his vision went beyond just military conquest. He was deeply involved in reshaping French society, administrative reforms, modernizing education, economic stabilization. His aim was to create a more efficient, centralized state, a state that could support those ambitious military campaigns.
And those campaigns, I think that's what we'll pick up next time. Because let's be honest, the Napoleonic Wars are what most people think of when they hear his name. Victories, conquests, a constant push for expansion. That's the Napoleon we all know.
Right. The Napoleonic Wars were a defining feature of his reign, and there's no denying his military genius, but even his most brilliant victories, they would eventually lead to overreach, setting the stage for a pretty dramatic downfall.
Yeah, it's true. You can't think of Napoleon without picturing those epic military campaigns, the clash of armies all across Europe.
It really does feel cinematic, the scale of it all, the ambition. I mean, he wasn't just defending French borders, he wanted to redraw the entire map of Europe. He did. And for a while, it seemed like he just might pull it off. Those early victories, like the Battle of Austerlitz in 1805, he completely outmaneuvered a much larger Austro-Russian army. That solidified his reputation as a military genius.
The book actually calls Austerlitz a perfect battle. Seems a bit dramatic, but I guess when you're on a winning streak, everything feels perfect.
Yeah, in this case, it wasn't far off. Napoleon's ability to anticipate his enemy's every move, using the terrain to his advantage, inspiring his troops with that almost superhuman confidence, it all came together at Austerlitz.
Makes you wonder what it must have been like to be one of his soldiers, witnessing those victories firsthand. Talk about a morale booster.
The sheer awe, the feeling of invincibility, it must have been incredible. But we can't forget those victories. As stunning as they were, they came at a huge cost. Thousands of lives lost, families torn apart by the constant warfare.
It's easy to forget about that when we romanticize these historical figures, the human cost behind all those grand strategies and victories.
Right. It's so important to acknowledge that darker side of Napoleon's legacy. As brilliant as he was still a conqueror, driven by an ambition that just consumed everything in its path.
And that ambition, that drive to conquer it, ultimately led to his downfall.
Right.
Right? I mean, you can't win them all.
Exactly. The turning point, as the book points out, was his invasion of Russia in 1812. What a gamble. And it backfired spectacularly.
Yeah, I remember learning about this in school, the scale of it, the scorched earth tactics, the brutal Russian winter. It's hard to fathom how he thought he could win against all that.
Well, his earlier successes, they might have blinded him to the realities on the ground. He underestimated the vastness of Russia, the resilience of the Russian people, and the sheer brutality of the climate.
So the same strategic brilliance that made him so successful might have worked against him in this case.
Now, that's an interesting point, and I think it gets to the heart of Napoleon's story. It's a story of brilliance and hubris. His strategic thinking, his ability to plan and execute those complex maneuvers, those were his strengths. But those strengths, when paired with that insatiable ambition, they could also become weaknesses.
It's almost a cautionary tale. Even the most brilliant minds, they can fall prey to overconfidence, that belief that they can control events that are ultimately beyond their grasp.
It really makes you think about leadership differently, doesn't it? True leadership isn't just about strategic brilliance. It's about knowing your limitations, knowing when to push forward and when to hold back.
So what happened after that Russian disaster? Was that the beginning of the end for Napoleon?
It was. The defeat in Russia, it shattered that myth of Napoleon's invincibility. It emboldened his enemies, and it led to a string of setbacks. He was defeated at the Battle of Nations in 1813, forced to abdicate, exiled to the island of Elba.
Exiled to an island. That sounds almost civilized.
Well, maybe, but this is Napoleon we're talking about. Exile wasn't going to keep him down for long. It actually fueled his desire for a comeback.
Wait, he escapes? Seriously? I'm picturing this grand escape scene, like something out of a movie.
Oh, it was dramatic. In 1815, Napoleon escapes from Elba, returns to France, rallies his supporters, a desperate attempt to regain power. This period, it's known as the 100 Days. It was a brief but intense resurgence of Napoleonic fervor.
So the emperor returns. Did he manage to recapture that old magic, that hold he had over France?
For a moment, it seemed possible. He was, after all, a master of propaganda, a charismatic leader who could still inspire loyalty. But his enemies were determined to stop him from regaining power, and it set the stage for the final showdown.
And that showdown was, of course, the Battle of Waterloo, right? The battle that ended Napoleon's reign once and for all.
Exactly. Waterloo, 1815. It marked the end of Napoleon's ambitions. No escape this time. No chance for a comeback. He was defeated decisively and exiled again, this time to the remote island of St. Helena in the South Atlantic.
From emperor to exile on a tiny island in the middle of nowhere. What a fall from grace. It's almost Shakespearean.
It really is. And it reminds us that even the most powerful figures, those who seem to shape the destiny of nations, they're ultimately subject to the whims of fate, the ever-shifting tides of history.
So Napoleon's story ends in exile, far from those battlefields and palaces of Europe. But his legacy, that's what keeps people fascinated. It's still debated today, isn't it?
Absolutely. Napoleon's legacy is complex. He was a conqueror who left a trail of destruction across Europe, but he was also a reformer, someone who introduced lasting changes to French society. His ideas influenced legal systems around the world.
And that's what makes him so interesting, right? This mix of brilliance and ruthlessness, of vision and tyranny.
Exactly. He embodies the contradictions of his time, those forces that were reshaping Europe. And his story, I think it resonates with us because it makes us ask those tough questions about the nature of power, the allure of ambition, and the impact individuals can have on the course of history.
It really is amazing to think about how one person's actions could have such a ripple effect. I mean, Napoleon's ambition basically reshaped the whole political landscape of Europe. But it wasn't just about military power, was it? The book really emphasizes his fascination with systems, with establishing order even when everything around him was in chaos. It mentions he was obsessed with math and strategy. Was that just a personality quirk, or did it play a bigger role in his success?
That's a great question, and it's one historians have been wrestling with for centuries.
Yeah.
I think it's easy to draw a straight line from that mathematical mind to his military strategies. I mean, he was famous for that calculated approach to warfare, his ability to analyze a battlefield, predict his opponent's moves.
Like a chess master, always thinking a few steps ahead.
Exactly. He saw the battlefield as a geometry problem, to be solved with logic and precision. And there's no doubt that approach contributed to many of his victories. Like Austerlitz, for example, his perfect positioning of troops, anticipating the enemy's movements, exploiting the terrain. It was strategic genius.
But then there's Russia, which seems like the opposite of strategic thinking. I mean, charging into that vast, unforgiving territory, it feels almost like a lapse in judgment.
And that's where it gets really interesting, because Napoleon's mathematical mind was a strength, but it could also be a limitation. In Russia, his reliance on logic and calculation, well, they didn't account for those things you can't really quantify. The brutal winter, the resilience of the Russian people, even the sheer size of the country.
He was trying to solve a human problem with math.
Precisely. And it's a trap that a lot of brilliant minds fall into, trying to impose order on a world that's inherently chaotic. And in Napoleon's case, I think that over-reliance on logic and strategy, well, it might have contributed to his downfall.
A good reminder that even the best laid plans can go wrong. There are always things we can't control. But let's switch gears for a second and talk about Napoleon's legacy. The book uses this really powerful phrase, the man who redefined Europe. Is that an exaggeration, or did he actually reshape the continent?
Well, I think it's safe to say that Europe would be a completely different place without him. His conquests redrew the map, dismantled old empires, sparked nationalist movements.
So he was kind of an accidental revolutionary, shaking things up, even though that wasn't necessarily his goal.
Yeah, in a way, his ambition, the drive to conquer, it unleashed these forces he couldn't fully control, like the spread of revolutionary ideals, the rise of nationalism. These were unintended consequences.
It's wild how one person can have such a ripple effect on history.
Yeah.
But how do we reconcile those two sides of Napoleon? The reformer, the legal scholar, but also the conqueror, the emperor, who waged endless wars.
It's the challenge, isn't it? To grapple with the complexities of a figure who embodied both progress and destruction, brilliance and ruthlessness.
I think that's just the nature of history. It's rarely black and white, usually shades of gray.
Yeah.
And Napoleon, with all his contradictions, he embodies that perfectly.
Absolutely, and that's why we're still so fascinated by him. He forces us to confront those tough questions about the nature of power, the limits of ambition, and the impact that individuals can have on the course of history.
We've only scratched the surface of this complex and fascinating figure. But if there's one thing I've learned from this deep dive, it's that Napoleon was more than just a conqueror. He was a revolutionary, a reformer, a tyrant, and a visionary, all wrapped up in one.
Truly a man of his time, but also someone who shaped his time. And his story is a reminder that history isn't just about dates and battles. It's about the lives of individuals who, for better or worse, leave their mark on the world.
And that mark, in Napoleon's case, it's still being debated today. So to our listeners out there, if you're intrigued by his story, I encourage you to dive deeper into the history, explore those contradictions, come to your own conclusions about this enigmatic figure. There's a whole world of knowledge waiting to be discovered. And who knows, you might even find a few surprises along the way.
Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep diving deep.